Hey there, and welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm your host, Caleb, and in today's conversation, we're diving deep into the complex intersections of faith, politics, and culture. And our guest today is none other than Scott Morrison, who served as Australia's 30th Prime Minister from 2018 to 2022. Scott is a figure whose actions and decisions have shaped modern Australia in profound ways. And we're going to explore how his faith has influenced his political decisions, the challenges of balancing personal beliefs and the demands of leading a nation, and his thoughts on the moral and cultural issues facing Australia today. Well, thanks so much for joining us today here on the Upside Down People, Scott Morrison. I'm so looking forward to having this conversation. You served as Australia's 30th Prime Minister between 2018 and 2022, and you're known for your leadership through moments like the COVID pandemic, national bushfires, dealing and wrestling with heavy climate change issues. But alongside that as well, you're also a man of faith, and you're known for holding your faith and political views very strongly. So welcome to the show. So looking
Thanks,
forward to
Philip.
having this conversation with you. Well, to sort of get into it, something I like doing with our guests, just to humanize them a bit for people who may not know them or have just heard about them, is maybe you can just share a bit about yourself, something that you enjoy doing, and who do you find as your most inspirational person?
Oh, look, I'm pretty sort of simple sort of fellow. Yes, I've had some rather fairly high profile jobs and things of that nature. But when I'm not, in a professional setting, I'm like most people. I think I'm very comfortable in the suburbs. We have a wonderful wife of over 35 years and two beautiful daughters, and we live down here in the Sutherland Shire in Sydney. We enjoy all the things about the Shire. I like getting out on the water. I like to cook a bit, love my Sharks, and I think we're going to have a good year this year in the NRL. And of course, being involved in our local church community, active reader and all those sort of things. But pretty normal, I'd say.
Yeah, well, how does a normal bloke like yourself end up being Prime Minister of Australia? What did that journey look like for you?
Not straightforward, not orthodox, I'd say. My involvement in politics over the entire time was sort of very much from an outsider, and had never really been involved in the inner workings of certainly organisational politics. But I happened to become the director of the party here in New South Wales of the Liberal Party back about 25 years ago, when it was in a bit of a mess and they needed a bit of a fix-up. And that's what I was sort of doing at the time. And so I came in and fixed the organisation organisationally, administratively, financially, and that sort of then introduced me and drew me into politics. But I'd been very interested in politics from a very young age, but hadn't been that directly involved. Had worked in public policy, things like this, but again, not so much in a partisan or directly political way. So, that was unusual, but that sort of rather independent way of coming into it. I don't mean independent, I'm not a liberal, no, I'm an absolute liberal, but independent in that not being involved with any sort of the organised groupings within organisational politics, where many do come through, and I tended to keep coming through the middle all the time.
Yeah, very good. You've coined the nickname, or people have coined the nickname Scomo around you. Where did that originate from?
It came up when I was in politics. I was always sort of known when I was younger as Scotty Mo, but I forget who actually started calling me it, but it just sort of someone did, and then it sort of stuck internally. And that's the way I think with most nicknames like that. You don't go out and pick them. Sort of people start calling you it for short, and that's our nature as Australians, I think, to do that. And as far as nicknames go, I was okay with it, so I was happy to embrace it.
Yeah, it's got a good ring to it. I think the people really enjoyed it. A prime minister that's yeah, one of them. Like you started off the conversation, is you come across as just an ordinary guy, but obviously you had some really challenging leadership. Not challenging leadership. You had some challenging issues during your time served as prime minister. Maybe
Yeah.
you can share a bit about that. Did you, yeah, during you had the bushfires, the COVID pandemic. Did you know you'd be met with such resistance and anger and frustration from the people? Did you know that there'd be that hostility?
Well, to be fair, I think a lot of what you referred to just then, there's how the media presented all this, and then there was what was actually happening on the ground, and they are often two very, very different things. And there's no doubt that over
Yeah.
time, when a narrative is run in media, that can catch on, and for those who aren't, directly linked to these events, that can start to form opinion. But wherever I went, I always recall a very warm reception, and still to this day, as virtually a day, if not a day, that passes when people don't approach me in the street, where it's here down in the Shire or anywhere else in the country. People are deeply appreciative of the efforts we put in during COVID, and as time passes, I think the reflection on that period of time and what was able to be done has endured, whereas some of the noise that was around the politics and the media criticism and things like this has basically fell away. But no, it was an unusual time. It was an extraordinary time. I mean, I don't think we had seen such a combination of such crises, whether they be the natural disaster crises or the pandemic, which was a 100-year event, and then of course we had the
Right,
strategic.
unprecedented.
Yeah. Oh, well, 100 years ago, that was the last precedent. But I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
there are other pandemics like SARS and MERS and things like that, but not on this global scale. And even if you go back 100 years, the world wasn't as interconnected as it is today, and so the broader global reach and impact of that pandemic even more significant. But and then there was, of course, the strategic challenges that we had in the region, a very aggressive and assertive China seeking to intimidate us and break us, particularly break us away from our allies and partners in the United States, in their bid to be dominant in our own region, which would have had disastrous consequences ultimately for Australia. And so there was no shortage of things to be pressing upon our attention, and we had to handle all of those. And I had an incredibly capable cabinet, very 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 decent people, but people who also could get a job done, and we all worked incredibly hard over that period. Others had their commentary, others took their shots. Sometimes they were cheap shots, and sometimes they were unfair. But as my chief of staff always used to say, if you want fair, get a different job. Don't go into politics, and I think that's true.
Right.
I don't think public are particularly sympathetic to the moanings and whingings of politicians and about how hard the job is. Well, if you don't want it, don't do it. Go and do something else. Go and bake bread, or do something else.
Brilliant. Well, that brings up a fascinating point, because when you talk about media, obviously media often the goal is to misconstrue and garner attention from the public. So they're trying to sell news that's going to get you hooked, and often can be really misleading, which we've seen unfold in the past 3 or so years, or the misinformation and disinformation. So how do you navigate that then when you're in such a position where, you're trying to listen to the public voice, and the media is saying this is what the public voice is, but that's obviously not true. Do you sort of just shut the media out in that sense and not look at the comments or what people are saying, or is there a strategy that you use as a politician?
Well, I think your assessment of sort of how the media operates is pretty accurate, and that has intensified, and it did over my entire time in public life. It got worse and worse. It hasn't just been 3 years; it's been going on for a decade, and just intensified as the technology and the various applications have become more mainstream. And so you have new media, legacy media, all of these sorts of things. And I think they are quite different in how you manage them. In some cases, it becomes a vicious circle. One informs the other, and so the vicious circle continues. And you get this downward spiral of misinformation. But I would say, regrettably, that too often these days, media begin with a narrative about what is happening and then force and take facts and bites and various things to reinforce that narrative. And that's not
Right.
news, that's opinion, with
Yeah.
fitting of facts to do that. And that's because I think over time news has become less important and opinion has become more interesting. But opinion is not fact and it's not news, and particularly when it's what we used to sometimes refer to as feel opinion. This is how I feel about this issue. Well, you feel however you like about the issue, but that doesn't define what the issue is and how you fix it, what you do about it. So, in some ways, you've got to make choices about, are you going to spend all your time in politics chasing chasing your tail around in the media space, or you got limited time and you're going to get on and do some things. And I tended more to the latter. I had teams of people who would seek to address that media environment, and we would seek to mitigate its negative impact. But ultimately, that proved to be very, very damaging to us. And once these narratives take hold, then they just morph in the social media space. Pardon me, and are reinforced by all sorts of devices, some of which were quite funny. But that's part of the weaponry that goes with that. And I do think, I feel for people growing up today. When I grew up and you read about politics, there were some authoritative sources. They were trusted, they were respected, and there was a sort of a credibility test that were applied to what people were saying. You just couldn't come out and say whatever you want and expect that to just go everywhere. Those filters are gone. Now there's some positives around that. There's a sort of a libertarian element to this, which is not a bad thing. And in many ways, politicians now can go around media to get their messages out directly. So there's, it's a double-edged sword. But to talk about its virtues, one should not also be unaware of its quite insidious, malevolent features.
Right. Yeah, and I think something that it's really brought to the surface and exposed in that malevolence of, I suppose, the depraved human nature is how people aren't really focused on the facts. They're more focused on defaming a character or a person, or really just trying to drag people down, which is really harmful when you're trying to cultivate a culture of honor and respect and seeking what the truth is and how it's going to better society. So I can definitely empathize with the difficult position politicians are in, where you have to try and navigate that tension of, we need to do a job and we need to stick to the facts, but we're also dealing with people who we need to serve. It's fascinating.
Well, I think that's all true. But to be honest, not all politicians are are innocent in the use of these tools either. And they can use them for the same purposes, and this is, you sort of get a cross fertilization of these things. I suppose it really goes back to we have the media and the information and the culture that we have created as members of that society. What we watch, what we allow, what we click on, what entertains us, what our priorities are. Well, we often, I think, see as a society reflected back to us in the mirror of what that new media is. So
very
it doesn't
good.
say great things about politicians, but sometimes it doesn't say such great things about all of us.
No, that's very true. And I think very much recently, like you said, over the past decade or so, I've been noticing, particularly in politics, it's hard to find, we just had a local election over here, but it's hard to find what people stand for. It's very easy to find what people stand against. And it's become, like you're saying, politicians do weaponize the other party when I think there's an importance for people to know, like, what are we standing for? What do we want to put our energy and effort into as a culture, as a community? Which, yeah, again, it's like that slight distinction of standing for something or standing against it. But yeah,
Well, I think that
fascinating.
tension.
I want to.
I was going to say that tension has always been in politics. By the way, that's not new. And how people are
Right.
perceiving where politicians stand. My comment about the media is that politicians can weaponize those same tools. I'll give you a good example. Back in 2016, we fought an election, and a proposition was advanced by the Labor Party at the time. We were in government, saying that we were going to privatise Medicare. Now, this was the most absurd idea you can imagine. I mean, it was ridiculous. We had no such
Right.
plans to do that. The mainstream legacy media, as you'd now call them, called it out and said, "This is nonsense. This is just not true." The leader of the opposition at the time, Bill Shorten, couldn't substantiate it in those fora. But it didn't stop them using a series of both social media tools and those types of things, which would ultimately pump algorithms. And at the same time, they hit the phones and rang pensioners at night and scared them. So these tools are used, and they're used to form opinion, to drive narratives, and to change how people perceive people in public life. So when you're up against that all the time, my point is, it's sort of hard to get through that wall of what others are trying to define you as, when you're simply seeking to live out in your service what you believe to be the best way forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'm curious. It's obviously, I think it's really easy to get stuck in the criticism of the role and like the hardships that you endured. But what would you say would be one of your greatest joys during your time served as PM?
Oh, there are many. I mean, the great privilege of being Prime Minister is the people you meet along the way. And whether it's the Queen, Her Majesty, the late Majesty Queen Elizabeth, or people who have just achieved amazing things in their own right, in their own corner of the world, or sadly those who have just gone through the worst imaginable tragedy. You find yourself meeting people in all sorts of extraordinary circumstances, and it's quite a thing to be exposed to that on almost a daily basis, and that gives you a very broad brush perspective on our country and the people who live there. You're inspired by it. You share their great tragedies, and at the same time you are uplifted by their incredible achievements. That's the most human, I
Yeah.
think, positive out of all, and one of the most enjoyable aspects of the job. Obviously, you don't join people's tragedies, but just the human connection that you have as a leader with people who are always looking to you, obviously, for direction and support, and in some cases solace. But it is a true privilege to have had that opportunity to do that for over what is in modern times a relatively long period of time, almost 4 years.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, before that, I don't think I think Australia almost got bad reputation for just cycling through PMs before the
Yeah.
term was done, which isn't a great look for a country either. So you handled that really well.
Yeah, I think we've broken
So
that cycle now.
tell us then,
I hope so, anyway.
yeah, yeah, hope so, because it is pretty damaging when because you start to question who can we trust, and if it's this easy just to throw someone out, then there's a lack of respect, and you really don't gain any ground as a country either, which I'm sure you
No,
know.
it puzzles out. It puzzles out other countries who deal with us. Um, it's particularly puzzling in presidential systems, like in the United States. They just don't quite understand how that happens. But I mean, obviously, in Canada and United Kingdom and New Zealand and places like that, they have similar systems, but they haven't gone down the same path as we have. But as I said, I was the first prime minister to go to two successive elections. Won one, lost one. But the fact that when I did
Yeah.
leave the office, it was by the choice of an election, not by a party room ballot.
Yeah. Do what like maybe you can just unpack that a bit more in terms of that difference between the United States system and the Australian system. Did you find that in terms of the position that you held, did you find that Australians felt a lot more comfortable approaching you as opposed to a US president where they're seen in the media, maybe it's a slightly shifting now, but they're seen in the media, but they're not very approachable, where I feel like the Australian Prime Minister seems a lot more approachable.
Well, that's true. It's also a nature of the sort of safety of our society and the nature of our culture. And you've got to remember, it was only a few months ago that now President Trump, then former President Trump, was almost assassinated by the smallest of margins. And there was a further attempt on his life. I mean, the US have lost presidents, too many. And, you know, you can perhaps link back to an underlying violence in the society. That's not to say the Australian society is perfect, but at the same time, I mean, even these days, people are often, particularly when I'm overseas, amazed that I just walk around and jump in Ubers and do things like this. They go, "Where's your detail? Where's the convoy? Where's the?" I don't need one. If I needed one, it would be here. But it's not because Australia doesn't provide it. I mean, if there was a security situation that required close personal protection of me as a former Prime Minister or any of the others, then it would be provided by the Australian Federal Police. But in Australia, thankfully, we don't have, or certainly not yet had, that level of potential violence extended to leaders, and which, as a result, means you can be more open and accessible. And I would go down to the games. I would be, I'd be around. People could approach me. They still do today, and I'm very happy that they do. It's just the nature of our society. We're a more philosophically egalitarian society. That said, though, in the United States, they have a deep respect for the office of the president, regardless who the occupant is, and they are able to separate the president, i.e., whoever it might be at a particular time, and the fact that they have a president. In Australia, I don't think there's the same appreciation of that, and that can be a negative for the way government politics and these sort of things work. There needs to be a level of respect, of course, but equally that respect has to be honoured and earned.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So you're mentioning before how one of the greatest joys that you found was just connecting with people. How did you navigate the tension between personal beliefs, your faith, and the will of the people? Were there moments in your leadership where you had to reconcile the convictions of your faith with the decisions that may have been unpopular?
Yes, there was, and you had to be proactive about it. But the best way to deal with it, I always thought, was honestly. I wasn't going to hide the fact that I was an evangelical Christian. I am. I have been for most, if not all, for most of my life. It is a big part of what makes me who I am and how I think and what I value and how I live. As a politician, that I think is important information for people to know when I was a politician. That I'm not seeking to project or proselytise others about that they should be doing this. I'm just being honest about who I am. So I tried to always err it and on that side and come on it from that perspective. But equally, particularly when you're a Prime Minister, you also didn't want that your personal position of faith to ostracise Australians who didn't share that faith. And so I would try as best as I could to go, this is what I believe, this is what makes me tick. Whatever makes you tick is your business. But I'm as equally passionate about your welfare as anybody else's. And just because you don't share my view about faith doesn't mean I'm any less your Prime Minister than anyone else. And I would try and make sure people felt that way. I mean, didn't always achieve that because, in Australia these days, I think sadly there's an increasing hostility towards Christianity, and we've seen just the appalling anti-Semitism. So, just the Judeo-Christian foundations of our country, I think there has been an increasing hostility which is which used to be a sort of it went from a passive acceptance to a sort of an indifference, and I'd say it's now moving towards increased hostility. And
Right.
it
What
takes
caused
more
that
courage.
shift, do you think?
What is it? Well, the country's become more secular. The country, we've always been a secular democracy. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying the
Mm.
country has become more secular. It's become, uh, you know, uh, unhinged, unleashed from, its. I'm not saying that this country was established like in the United States by pilgrims, fleeing religious persecution. That's not our foundings. I mean, my grandfather many times back came on the first fleet in chains, so he didn't choose to come here because of religious persecution. He came here at the sentence of the British government. So it's a different story, but. That said, culturally, the West has been, driven by Judeo-Christian values, and I think while people like
Right.
elements of those today, the faith connection to them is resisted, and in many cases, is quite hostile to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the very air we breathe, in terms of like things that we value, like kindness or morality, just these basic, even human rights, at the very core of that is like what you're saying is this. It's built on Christian values,
You must
and
have
if
read
we
that book,
didn't
The Air
have
We
those
Breathe.
values.
Did you read the book, The Air We Breathe?
Yes, I
I read
did.
it as
Yeah, I
well.
actually had a conversation with Glenn Scrivener.
Glenn, yeah, I thought Glenn's book.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed Glenn's book. I thought it was excellent, and I think well, that's the answer to the question you're asking. Glenn's right, in short. But as is Tom Holland, and many others who've written about this topic. I think particularly I feel for younger people these days growing up with a Christian faith. It was different when I was either
mm,
your age or even younger. This was not
mm,
an unusual thing. Um, and today it is. You're not the majority.
yeah,
You're the minority. And
yeah,
particularly if you hold a particularly strong faith, you're very much in the minority. In fact, you're a weirdo. Um, and
right,
that's often how people see you. And they don't understand it. There used to be a societal understanding of many Christian stories and theology and things like this. Not saying they're all bent over their Bibles every 5 minutes, but they knew who Moses was. They knew the stories of the Old Testament. They knew, and if I look back at the language of say Robert Menzies, he would often use that type of language, and he would make those references to biblical passages. And people sort of in that era found that I imagine a a good tool of communication, but sometimes reassuring. When I would do it as prime
yeah,
minister, I'd be attacked for being, imposing my faith on others and being,
right,
insensitive to the religious views of others. The irony about that is the greatest support I received when it came to issues of religion and religious freedom didn't just come from Christians. They came from Hindus
mm,
and Buddhists and Muslims and people who have a faith get the importance of
yeah,
faith. People who don't, they're entitled to that. Because that's a
mm,
faith too. I have that view, and I think Glenn said that out in his book. Certainly,
yeah,
many others have made that point. If you don't have a faith, that's fine. You just think it happened another way, and you're living your life on that belief system, and good luck to you. But I don't share it. But I think it takes more faith to believe that than what I do. But but if you don't choose to have a faith of that nature, I find the intolerance and the bigotry that was directed towards
mm,
evangelical Christians in particular was odd. I mean, I had a rather bizarre experience one Easter where, because it even happens within the Christian denominations. I mean, I go to a Pentecostal church
yeah,
in Sydney. I haven't always been in a Pentecostal church. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, then they turned a Uniting Church in Australia, and then I was in the Christian Brethren Assemblies, the Open Assemblies, and then I was in the Baptist Church. I just went to local churches. I didn't really care
right,
that much about denominations.
yeah,
But when I was Prime Minister, people made a lot of, the first Australian Pentecostal Prime Minister. I just did not see myself that way. I was a Prime Minister who happened to go to a Pentecostal church. But I remember one Easter on the Good Friday, I went to the Maronite public service, which we love going to as a family. We have many friends in that community. Cameras everywhere, news crews, all the rest of it. I'm giving a reading up there, as are Labor politicians. Great, terrific, wonderful. 2 days later, I go to my own church, the church I go to most
Wow.
Sundays when I'm there. And the cameras came in there and all hell broke loose. How dare he bring cameras into his church and put his hands up and praise God and have himself filmed doing this? I was just confused. I was in a church 2 days
Wow.
ago and you didn't care. What's the difference between being in a
Right.
Maronite church and a Protestant Pentecostal church on Easter Sunday? I just found that
Double
more ignorant.
standards.
Well, it definitely
Yeah.
was a double standard, and that was within two more traditional, understood Catholic, because Maronites are Catholics ultimately, faith, and what was, less widespread. And I, I don't think it's deliberate bigotry. I just think it's ignorance of Christian things
Yeah.
in an increasingly secularized society. And as Christians in a highly secularized society, we can't assume that people know what on earth we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I think something that uh, all the controversy or whatever people's opinion may be of you, I think something that Australians I found definitely agree about is your authenticity and honesty, and that's something I think they really appreciate. Like you're saying, you've always held your faith openly, and talked about it openly, and I think that's something like people really respect and admire. That yeah, they might be hostile towards it, but at the end of the day, they know you're someone they can trust because you haven't tried to hide anything from them that might try and manipulate their views or their opinions of yourself. You've just said, hey, this is who I am, this is what I believe,
Well, it's kind of you to
which
say.
which is refreshing in our culture.
I would hope that's the case. That was my intention. I'm not without my serious um, shortcomings as well. We all have those, and I've made mistakes,
Yeah.
and there's some things I regret, but not in the not in the broad, not in the whole. I mean, everyone does. I mean, often you ask that question, oh, which ones do you regret and which one? It really doesn't matter. What matters is, did you learn from
Right.
them and did you go on from them? And the answer on all those questions is yes. That's what I tell my kids. The only mistake you make is the one you don't learn from. And I think that's really
Right.
important because you're going to make heaps. We're people.
Yeah.
We get selfish. We get arrogant. We get tired. We get stupid. But we're also capable of extraordinary grace and generosity and love and care and ingenuity. I mean, people are amazing. But we're not that consistent all the time.
Yeah.
And it's strange. We seem to hold others to a standard of perfection that we don't really appreciate, isn't really lived up to on our own part. I mean, a bit more sensitivity to human vulnerability, I think, would go a long way, especially in politics.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. So, just wanting to capture a bit of your motivation and your heart behind you. You recently published and wrote a book. Many have said it's a memoir as well. So, Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's testimony of God's faithfulness. What led you to writing that? What motivated you, and what's your hope for people that read it?
Well, I just wanted to share my faith story, in short. I didn't want to share my political memoir or a journal of record and to promote, what I did or, defend my against criticisms. I mean, that's what normally happens. And people want to do that, it's fine. Those books, I've read those books. I didn't find too many autobiographies terribly interesting, but with maybe one exception, which was Tony Blair's, and the reason I liked it, I thought it was quite honest. I think about things. Most of them are just sort of CVs, and very long
Right.
ones at that, and can be a bit tedious. But what I wanted to do was, I wasn't able to say everything about my faith while I was Prime Minister for the reasons you said before and in politics, because I think there is an acceptable and reasonable limit. I mean, I could never have written that book while I was
Right.
Prime Minister. I think that would have been a bit too confronting, I think, for many people. But I can once I've left the office. And I also wanted to say to Christians, look, this is the society we're living in. I lived in a time and in a role in a secular democracy government, and it's you got to hold on to some important truths and things. Being a Christian in that environment, and my hope is, and thankfully, I think this has been achieved based on the feedback and the way people have come up to me and thanked me for it. It's just to say, to encourage people, keep the faith. You can do it. Remember Daniel? He did. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They did. And there are plenty of others who did in hostile times to their own faith. And I think it's important that we do that. That doesn't mean you need to, I joked in the book about writing in capital letters on Facebook. That's not living your faith, right? Shouting at people on Facebook and getting angry about, the wickedness of society and all this sort of stuff. No, that's just nuts.
Yeah.
And people think it's weird.
Yeah.
And guess what? It is. So stop doing that. But it is important to stand up for truth and all these sorts of things. But as Christians, we've got to be wily about this. And we can be
Yeah.
misinterpreted. We can be what we say and do can be misused and work against us. So. And that's increasingly tough, I think, in the world in which we live. So we've got to be wise about these things. But most of all, we've got to live it as best we can ourselves. And that doesn't mean we won't fail. Of course we will. And the world and others will quickly jump on our failures, and particularly moral failures and things like this. And that's why we need to pray. That's why we need strength. That's why we need faith community. That's why we need to be humble and submit ourselves. And because it's tough out there. It is tough. And so
Yeah.
that's why I wrote the book. I just said, well, this has been my journey. This is how I've tried to deal with it, albeit imperfectly. Hopefully that encourages you on yours.
Yeah. Well, I'll put a link up to your book if anyone wants to grab it in the episode description as well. And one last question for yourself, Scott. Something I usually do with our guests is I ask our previous guest to ask our next guest. They don't know each other or know who I'll have on next, but just a question. And my previous guest was Zach Taylor. He's someone who... He's an Enneagram coach. I don't know if you're aware of the Enneagram. It's like a personality framework. But he does that in counseling, and he's a pastor
I have
as
no
well.
idea what you're talking about. I think we've got a generation thing going on now.
The question that he had is what have you been wrong about?
What have I been wrong about? Oh, look, plenty of things, but see, there's big things and there's little things. I mean, we're wrong about little things all the time. We'll make misjudgments. We'll think things are going to turn out a particular way and they don't, and our assumptions might have been false. And they're small things. On big things, look, I don't live with a lot of regrets, to be honest, because you've got to give yourself a bit of a break. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. During COVID, I was at the time quite against early on the borders going in place between Western Australia and the rest of the country. I was wrong about that. Did I make the decision about what I was doing at the time based on the best information I had and what yeah, I did. So do I have hang-ups about it now? No, I don't. Like, you're going to make decisions. You've got to make them in the moment. You don't have hindsight when you make them. You've got to get the best information you can. So what I suppose to answer that question, what I've always tried to do is put myself in the best position I can to make the best decision I can. Now, if I've done that and I still get it wrong, well, unfortunate, learn from it, move on. But I'd say to people who are listening to this, you are going to get things wrong. That's not what matters. What matters is how you're trying to get them right. And the more you focus on that, learn from your mistakes, and being able to move on and ensuring you get your process right around decision making, well, the percentages mean you're going to get more good decisions than bad. Now, I would, fiercely argue that has been my experience. And one of the reasons is I don't dwell that much, hence the pause in answering the question on that stuff. I've taken lessons in my life on many occasions, but then I move on. I don't let it hold me down, and particularly when it comes to, the sort of things that talks in the Bible about Satan being the accuser of the brethren. That's probably harking back to my times in a more traditional conservative church when I was younger. But, it's often in those periods of your life, that's when a lot of these things sort of stay with you for longer and,
Right.
using those more traditional versions. But that's what he does. He wants to throw your failures at you every day. He wants to remind you of everything you've done wrong, every reason you're unworthy, every reason why you shouldn't have a crack at something, every reason why you shouldn't try something, whether it be in healing a relationship or anything. And I'll give you this answer, because that's drawn one thing out in my mind. The biggest mistake you'll make is not to forgive someone. And I've been on occasions, I haven't forgiven people. Well, every day you're going to be offended, wronged, taken advantage of, potentially, passed over, mistreated, not appreciated, angered, quite justifiably, all this sort of stuff. If you carry that stuff and you carry that sense of offence, and I write about this in the book, with you, guess who it's hurting? You. You're the only person that's hurting. The person who has done this to you, either ignorantly, malevolently, or otherwise, they have to wrestle with that for themselves, and they can, say sorry, or they can seek forgiveness if they wish. But that shouldn't affect whether you forgive or not, because if you don't, that's a terrible mistake, because you carry it around forever. Now, I saw this in politics all the time. I saw the bitterness of people's disappointed ambitions. Politics is a tough, hard, unforgiving, unsympathetic, emotionally brutal business to be in. You need the skin of a rhinoceros to get you through that, and I think, and a faith to match, in my case. But if you hold on to that stuff, as I've seen so many people do, disappointment, offence, and it just affects the rest of their lives. And I just find it really grieves me when I see it. I've tried, perhaps imperfectly, to think about all of those things that occurred and to just forgive.
Yeah, that's a brilliant answer. Thanks so much for that. And what question will you want to give for our next guest?
Well, who do you need to forgive?
Who do you need to forgive?
You don't have to say why.
That's a deep one. That's a pretty vulnerable one.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Thanks so much for your time, Scott Morrison. I've really appreciated it. And thanks for your thoughts and your insights, and just for leading authentically and vulnerably, despite public opinion, despite opposition, despite those many opportunities, like you said, that you have to hold unforgiveness and let it turn into bitterness and resentment, and for trusting in Jesus and showing really the faith communities what that looks like. Appreciate your time, and I hope you have a good week ahead.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for the opportunity to come on.